Whoa, there's so many of you. I spend most of my working days sitting in a chair with a laptop, pretty much by myself, except that my wife has said that I spend all my time in other places with other people who, of course, are completely imaginary and often deeply troubled. And I said, yes, but they know me there. I'm on good terms. Today, we're talking about memoir. And so it's fitting that the first thing I show you is a page from an actual memoir, a diary, written by my late mother-in-law, Wilma Judy Cardell. Let's see. Push button. No? Ah. Did I push too many buttons? Yes. There we go. And if I live to be 100, I'll never know how the boat came to be on our side of the creek. And that's how she began that particular volume. She was a lifelong diarist, and there are, I think 15 volumes of these. And she was fairly amazing. She would have said that she wasn't a writer. If you said, oh, I love your writing, or, any of the things that you say, she would say that she wasn't a writer. And that's just something that many of you would probably also say. As he gets lost. And yet she starts by serving up a fabulous first line that makes us want to read more, which is the objective of writing, and it's why we're here today, to write in a way that makes our readers want to read more, want to know more. I admit to being Jonathan Thomas Stratman. I'm a novelist at this point in my life. I have 6 books published in 2 series. I have a mystery series for adults, and I have an adventure series for the middle grades. And I should tell you that most of the middle grade books are most reviewed by adults who like them also. I'm currently writing my 10th and 11th books and getting ready to publish my 7th. All of the books published so far take place in Alaska, but I have others coming up that take place along the Puget Sound. I'm already behind on my buttons. This is my first PowerPoint, so we're bonding. Okay, there's a little bit of a delay, so I'm a novelist, and there we go. These are the covers to the first 2 books in my 2 series. So now I'm caught up. I was raised in Alaska. That's me holding the dog a long time ago. My father was an Episcopal priest, and they marry. Some people only know about Roman Catholics who don't marry, and I say my father was a priest, and they give me an odd look. I was a commercial writer for 35 years. And that means that companies hired me to do any kind of writing that they needed. This means writing for packaging, everything from packaging for products to speeches. I've written all kinds of ad stuff, print, radio, TV, audio features for NPR and others. I've written a lot of video. I've written for McDonald's, Shucks, which used to be an auto parts company, U.S. Bank, Bank of America, Holland America, Starbucks, which is what this is. After all these years of writing, this is one of my favorite pieces because it's simple and elegant. It's selling you coffee, yes, but it comes with a pretty picture, and it reads well. Summer's so close you can taste it. And the thing you probably don't know about a simple line like that is that I had to write about 500 lines to get to that one, or to have that one among them. And I'm lost. I've written, and here I push the button again, I figure something like 2 million words in the last 35 years. About 800,000 or 1 million of those are novels. The thing about being a commercial writer, and why I start out telling you about it, is that it cuts across the lines of something that every writer encounters. People always ask writers, do you have to be inspired? People are fascinated with the notion of inspiration. Push button. There we go. Inspiration, spiritus, is the Latin word for breath, to make a thing or a process come alive, which is what we want to do as writers, make an episode from our past come alive. People come up to me and they tell me, and this happens more frequently than you'd think, that they just write like gangbusters when they feel inspired. And so the logical question, what I always ask them is, well, how often does that happen? And they say, well, not very often, actually. So they have good intentions to be inspired. So what we want to know as writers of memoirs or writers of books, writers of anything, we want to know, this is the big question, how do you get inspired? How do you get inspired when you need to be inspired? How can you make sure you're available to write at the moment when you are precisely in that sweet spot of inspiration? At first glance, it seems that you probably can't do that, but you can. Professional writers do it all the time, and you can too, whether you're writing poems or memoirs or whatever it is that you feel inspired to write. Years ago, my wife and I produced a video series called The Writer at Work. It was a wonderful way we had gotten into video. When you're in advertising and you write video, sooner or later someone comes into your office and drops your script on the desk and says, you wrote this, you produce it. And so I made the segue from writing to producing, and then later Billy and I started our own company and began to produce. And we had the great good fortune to start out very high on the writer list with some of the best of the popular genre writers available in that moment. I'll start by telling you about one that got away. I had sent a note to Ray Bradbury, whom I admired a great deal, and I told him about the project, and I asked him if there was any possibility that we could tape him first. And I knew it was a long shot. And after I sent the letter, I went to lunch with somebody who said, oh, Bradbury's dead. Now, that's kind of embarrassing. So a week or so later, I'm standing in my kitchen and the phone rings. I pick up the phone. This is, for those of you with long memories, remember when the phone hung on the wall and had a wire? Yeah, it was one of those. So I picked it up and I said hello, and the voice said, this is Ray Bradbury. And I thought to myself, in a pig's eye. But then I do a lot of radio work, and I recognized his voice, and I knew that it was him. And I said, well, gosh, it's really, really good to hear your voice. Somebody told me that you were dead. And he says, I get that all the time. They get me confused with Gene Roddenberry, who did Star Trek. And he said that he and Roddenberry had gotten together and laughed about it a lot, that they two of them were confused. And he said that he had gone to Roddenberry's funeral, but Roddenberry hadn't gone to his yet. It's honestly one of the great thrills of my life to have picked up the phone and had somebody, had Bradbury call me. But on to the story. We did get mystery writers for our series: Earl Emerson, Aaron Elkins, J.A. Jantz, and Tony Hillerman, and a top-of-the-heap children's writer, Jane Yolen. So we did very well with these. Started out, we got really good talent. Every writer we taped touched on the question of inspiration, which is actually why I'm going on about this. It's one of the most common questions for writers. But the answer that I remember best came from Aaron Elkins. I've been quoting him ever since. And he said, I get inspired every morning at 9 o'clock. This is one of the great lessons of writing. It's the truest thing anybody will or can tell you about writing. Get to your workstation. Get to your desk, your chair, at the appointed time, and start writing. It will happen. You will be inspired. But let me tell you something about that. In the movies, when they finally get to the chair and start writing, they get kind of a beatific look on their faces. I think you've probably all seen at some point a movie about a writer, and you, in the audience, you think, they're inspired now. I can see it. It's happening. Well, I need to tell you, for most of us, it doesn't happen like that. In any given writing moment, you don't get to look or feel that blissful. Writing is work. It looks and feels like work. Your butt hurts. Your eyes cross. Sometimes you need a break. It's easy to slide into other things. Oh, better check my email again. Facebook, don't get me started. And at one time or another, you end up saying most of the bad words you know, whatever they may be. Sometimes you can get a little chant of bad words going if the writing is frustrating you. There are days or more the writing just doesn't feel like it's going all that well. Elkins told us about a journal he kept during the writing of one of his mysteries. By the way, if you like mysteries but haven't read his protagonist is a forensic anthropologist. He solves most crimes by examining and knowing about old bones, sometimes prehistoric, sometimes more recent. Anyway, Elkins kept a journal through the writing of this whole book. Later, when the book had been published, he went back through to compare the times he had felt really good about what he was doing, the times he felt inspired, and the times he just felt like he was dogging it. And when he compared the journal he'd kept to the writing he'd done, there was no difference. It was just about how he felt. The writing was consistent. But this brings us to the first of the 5 easy steps I promised, and I may have been exaggerating. If you're going to do this or any writing project successfully, author McKinley Cantor said this in a memorable way. Put your butt in the chair. Without that, you got nothing. Show up. on the most regular schedule you can muster. First thing every morning, usually 6 days a week works best for me. Actually, I do it 7 days, but find the day off is important as well. And then on Monday, I'm ready to go again. When you're a writer, you go to book shows and readings, and people come up to you and tell things about themselves and about their writing. They tell you not so much about what they are writing as what they would like to write and what they're thinking about writing someday, maybe. A lot of them are thinking of writing their memoirs. I tell them to hurry up. You've probably heard this, the one who dies with the most toys wins. But that's not really the truth, is it? The truth is, the one who dies with the most toys is dead. All done, finished. Always amazed when the right one turns up. Whatever we know about life, business, love, whatever family stories about a husband or wife, father or mother, that time at the lake, that kiss, 1,000 or 2,000 other small moments, whatever we know about all those things, it's all wiped clean when we leave the planet. It's all gone, it's all irretrievable. To be clear, we're talking about a memoir, which is not an autobiography. A memoir is an episode from life, written from personal knowledge or experience. When you leave the planet, everything in your head leaves with you. Private accomplishments, memories, experiences, unique truths you've discovered along the way, things you were privately proud of. All those things are left in the hearts and minds of people who knew you and loved you. Abigail McCarthy, writer, teacher, wife of Eugene McCarthy, said, "Every memoir reminds us of the far away and long ago, reminds us of loss and change, reminds us of persons and places beyond recall." Beyond recall is significant because unwritten memories aren't backed up in any kind of cloud. That would be handy, wouldn't it? Never have to write. Which means when you go, your memories go with you. Which means that you die twice, once when you stop breathing, and again when the last memory of you fades. These are memories that you always thought you'd share. You told stories, and maybe you did. You told stories on long drives or around the campfire or around the table after dinner, and they were funny or sad. And some were stories you told again and again, maybe stories your kids or grandkids asked you to tell. Some stories they will remember and they will pass on as long as they live. Others not so much, and others for only a while. There's a part of us, of some of us anyway, a secret part through our whole lives that believes, and I find this happening to me, which is why I mention it, that believes that the lessons I've learned, my best moments, my discoveries, my personal realizations, an essence really, will somehow remain and somehow be known to my kids, for example, and grandkids, people that follow. And of course, the truth is, they won't, not without assistance from us, from you, from me. The Roman poet Cicero said, "The life given us by nature is short, but the memory of a well-spent life is eternal," which is not a bit true, of course. My father told me 1,000 things about himself, about his father or mother, his grandfather or grandmother. And I do remember some of those things, but I couldn't pass the quiz. And I say to my brothers, I have two brothers, they're younger than me, and neither is as bright. But I say to them, or modest, I say to them, do you remember that story Dad told about whatever it was? And they say, no. So how much about my dad will my kids remember? Not much. And how much about me? But here's a bit of luck. What I do know about my father's life, about the time he felt most alive, he wrote down. I have it right here. He called the book, or the collection, Ninana, after the small town in Alaska where we lived, starting from when I was about 7. This was before, long before, POD, which stands for print on demand. He wrote it, printed it out on his office printer, and had it bound. I think he took it to Office Depot and had it comb bound for $10 maybe. It's low tech, but I have it. I can hold it in my hand, read it whenever I want, read it to the kids and grandkids. You could do this. I wish he'd done more of this in his life, and I wish he hadn't waited so long. By the time he got to it, he'd lost many of the finer details as he headed into Alzheimer's. At the end, we couldn't ask him anything. And this brings me to the second thing to know and remember about memoir writing. Come on, you can do it. Anything you write to leave behind is better than not writing. You could write poems, you could write letters. Did that? Good. An autobiography, did I go? Yeah, is usually objective, a balanced recreating of time, place, and event. It starts at the very beginning and works through to the end. My light is blinking. A memoir doesn't have to be any of those things. It doesn't have to be objective. It doesn't have to be balanced. Behave. Oh, it's taped. It is subjective. It is personal. There's no requirement of balance in a memoir. You get to tell it like you remember it. It starts and ends where you want it to. I've got an example of a memory from my childhood that I wrote into the opening episode of my first novel, which is called Chichako, which is Alaskan for greenhorn. Somebody who doesn't know anything and came from somewhere else and probably ought to go back. It's like my own light show. Okay. So this is the first chapter, beginning of the first chapter of Chichako. Will nearly made it to safety before they spotted him. Get him! Someone shouted. Will started running through the wet snow, bulky math book tucked under his elbow like a football. Galumping along in his heavy wool jacket and knee-high rubber boots, he struggled for speed. His lungs burned as panting and scrabbling for footing in the slush, he made for the safety of the school door. 5 boys chased Will with Edwin in the lead. For no reason that Will could figure, Edwin and his friends had decided to make his life miserable by ambushing him before school, after school, or any other time it pleased them. An ice ball slammed him on the ear, knocking the wool hat off his head, stinging as badly as a punch. That's when they caught up and surrounded him. Edwin pushed through the others and jammed his face so close that Will smelled his breakfast breath. "Leave me alone," gasped Will. "Leave him alone," Edwin parroted, and turned to share a laugh with the other boys. "You want to fight me now, Chichaco? Or are you chicken?" He turned to his friends. "I think he's chicken." The clanging school bell signaled the end of Edwin's performance, but before Will could breathe a sigh of relief, Edwin shoved him backwards. Will's feet on sheet ice, skimmed with meltwater, shot out from under him. He went down hard, ice water soaking through jeans and boxers. Climbing to his feet, still clutching his book and grabbing his hat, Will turned and started up the concrete steps. For the umpteenth time this winter, he read the painted sign above the door, Nenana Public School. "Welcome to Alaska," he muttered to himself, his pants once again wet and cold and stuck to his butt. That was one of my opening experiences in Nenana as a youth. So I was able to remember it and recreate it, and it's a good start for the book. I have a quote here. I'm sorry, I don't know who said this. At its best, the memoir offers a window into the author's motivations, emotions, and endeavors, a peek, a glimpse. Memoirs have often been written by politicians or military leaders as a way to record and publish an account of their public exploits. A famous example is Ulysses S. Grant after the Civil War. If you remember, Mark Twain helped him write and publish his memoirs, and he was dying and destitute, and his memoirs turned around his fortunes and a lot of how he's remembered today. Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars are about his experiences fighting the local armies, tribes actually, in what is today France. Some of you, especially if you studied Latin, will already know the beginning. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. A long time ago, I read this in Latin. Did any of you read that in Latin? Yeah, I thought so. I couldn't do it today. Here's a sample, an extremely well-written first paragraph from a more recently published memoir. A few months after my 21st birthday, a stranger called to give me the news. I was living in New York at the time on 94th between 2nd and 1st, part of that unnamed shifting border between East Harlem and the rest of Manhattan. It was an uninviting block, treeless and barren, lined with soot-colored walk-ups that cast heavy shadows for most of the day. The apartment was small, with slanting floors and irregular heat, and a buzzer downstairs that didn't work, so that visitors had to call ahead from a payphone at the corner gas station, where a black Doberman, the size of a wolf, paced through the night in vigilant patrol, its jaws clamped around an empty beer bottle. That's pretty vivid, isn't it? This is from Barack Obama, Dreams of My Father. The writing is vivid, descriptive. He doesn't tell us it's a bad part of town. The writing shows us. We get to see it with our own eyes and arrive at our own conclusions. As we read the words, we can play the movie of it behind our own eyelids. And in the first line, he sets up for what is to come. A stranger called to give me the news. Sometimes when I talk to people about writing memoir, they get uncomfortable because, the simplest memoir is a diary. You just sit down and, let's see, Billy, my wife Billy, her grandmother kept a diary, and it's a little amusing maybe that on the day that Billy was born, her grandmother wrote something like, did the wash, baked a cake, Wilma had a baby girl, in that order. But also, a memoir can be much more descriptive, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. With Obama, the writing is vivid, descriptive. He doesn't tell us it's a bad part of town. The writing shows us. We get to see it with our own eyes and arrive at our own conclusions. Oh, I already did that. And here's another sample. This is from the memoir I mentioned, Ninana, written by my father. This is about the time in his life, the 1950s, when he was a young missionary priest transplanted from Boston and Harvard to a tiny village in Alaska. This was the time, he said later, that he felt most alive. In fact, after a whole life lived in a variety of places, the hill across from the town above the river is where he asked us to take his ashes. And here is the intro paragraph from Ninana. And interestingly, an excerpt from this was published in the Massachusetts Review. So it was his memoir, and really not adorned, although he was a pretty competent writer. So he said, over time, the material things of childhood shrink in our perception, but the things we like and the persons we love become magnified. This is a love story, a Lazarus tale of the almost dead past, containing persons and events from long ago. And it needs telling now, or it will be blown away by the winds of change across the tundra. An old Cherokee saying that my father told me suggests that we will all, as we age, become smaller and smaller until finally we are carried away by the spirit winds. This is Lee William Stratman from his unpublished book, Ninana. His stories aren't about a war, aren't about a life that led to the presidency, the big life led grandly. His stories are the small life lived deliberately, like Thoreau. Remember his line, I went to the woods to live deliberately. So Dad and Thoreau take us up to the third point, which in its way is the most important. Tell the small story, but tell it big. Tell it richly. This is the thing about memoir that people often miss. A memoir is not the big deal, often. In fact, mostly not a big deal. Most memoirs are episodes, small, vivid moments. Here's an example, one I actually tape recorded and have never forgotten. I had an older relative on my wife's side. He'd grown up in Western Oregon, been a logger, a farmer. He ran against all the stereotypes. He worked with his hands and with his muscles, but was an avid reader and always a good thinker. He was a Rube Goldberg tinkerer of the first order. He could build anything with a torch and a welding machine. Ugly, but functional. I wish I could show you how he rebuilt the rusted-out window cranks from an old Volvo I was driving. I wanted to videotape him. He was getting up into his 80s. But he was in good health, and he still went out every year to make his own firewood, but none of us get out of here alive. Near the beginning of his life, when he was about 8, something potentially catastrophic happened. He never forgot, and now I haven't. It's a small thing, but maybe you won't forget it either. Now, he didn't want to tell his story. And I think this is something a lot of you can identify. You think, oh, I don't want to tell my story, or I don't have any story to tell. I mean, we think a lot of different things about recording our own histories. And I told him the same things that I'm telling you today. When you die, everything goes with you. None of it goes into the cloud. And we were camping out in the mountains over by Bend, and I had a video camera along, and I cornered him by a crackling fire, which is always a good place for storytelling. You may remember that Klondike poet and balladeer Robert Service called a campfire the confessional. I told him what I'm telling you now: when you're gone, it all goes with you. And he stood there and he thought about it. I mean, you could see him thinking about it. He was that kind of guy. And then he dropped his butt into a canvas chair and started talking. He was born about 1910 and spent his early years along the Coos River in coastal Oregon. This was before roads, when the river was the highway. Farms sent milk to town by boat. Archie and his brother Ole and their sisters went to school by riverboat. So on a bright summer day, Archie and Ole are down by the river, and Archie's about 8 and Ole's about 10. And Archie's playing on the float, and Ole has half a skiff. He's rowing half a skiff out on the river. And I don't know how you do that. I mean, carefully, I think, is probably the answer. But Archie falls in. Archie can't swim. Now, I should tell you that Archie's pride and joy, this was back in the, gosh, I don't know, probably before 1920. There was no way he would have a watch. This is before wristwatches. This is the days of pocket watches. But Archie had a pill bottle that he prized. It was one of those round ones. You've probably seen antique pill bottles that are actually round and just about pocket watch sized. And he actually carried it in his watch pocket. You know how in your jeans, I think some of them still have watch pockets. Very proud of that watch. Well, so Archie falls in. Archie can't swim. He goes down. Ole sees him. He's nearly all the way across the river in half a boat. And he starts rowing. And he's yelling, "Hold your breath, hold your breath." And Archie bobs to the surface, grabs a breath. And of course, he's kind of moving downstream also. It's not going to be easy. Ole's yelling for him to hold his breath, and he's trying to row this half a boat back across the river. And Archie goes down again. Ole finally gets to him, and he gets to where he thinks he might be, and he throws himself down, and he jams his arm down in the water, and somehow he catches hold of Archie, and he pulls on him. And he wasn't much bigger than Archie, but he manages to drag him up out of the water and drag him into the boat and drops him in the bottom of half a boat, and then I think reasonably thought that Archie would be grateful. But what happens, of course, is that Archie kind of gets up and he kind of reaches in his pocket and he says to his brother, "You broke my watch." And Archie was telling me this just a few weeks after Ole had died, and so he was actually kind of quivery about it. It was, he'd never forgotten, and for a variety of reasons, it's stayed with me. It's a little episode, a little bit of a life, but it's interesting, and it takes us back. And takes us back to that moment and lets us live in a different time and remember people who are completely gone. I mean, they're all dead. There's a road now. They don't even go down the river. And so it's a small story, 3 minutes on a river from 100 years ago. It's about a page of typing. Would take you, I don't know, an hour maybe less. It's a simple story, as most stories really are. It's the kind of thing you could write in the morning with your coffee without breaking a sweat. And this has happened to me. I get with my kids or with family, and stories come up one after another, just kind of like this. Then later, my wife says, "You need to start writing those down." And I think, huh? By then, I've forgotten what I was talking about. And I have a much harder time thinking about what I would write. So the best way to figure out what to write is to note down the stories you find yourself telling, or have somebody else note those stories down. It's pretty easy to get caught up in your moment and forget to keep track. These are the stories, the ones you tell anyway, that you really want to start with because you're already good at telling them. You already know that your family wants to hear them. They're the ones they ask you for. But sometimes what happens is just you sit down to write and you honestly can't think of a single story you want to tell. I mean, I write for a living and this happens to me. So, here are a few memoir prompts. This is a particularly good one because a lot of us have collections of photos that we've inherited. And some of them don't make much sense. We look at them and think, huh? My mother has a picture of her Aunt Annie that I'll tell you about. In the photo, she's standing next to a man, and both of them are looking at the camera. She's a nearly square-shaped woman, about as wide as she was tall, wearing a sweater with a long skirt of the period, the 1930s, and wearing a small cloche sort of hat. Aunt Annie has no arms. The photo can't tell us, and never will, that in her younger days she was what my mother called a showgirl with the circus, including Barnum and Bailey. There was a lot less of her in those days. She went out in tights and a little sequined outfit and danced and held hoops for lions and tigers. She married Uncle Petey, who was a trapeze artist, a small, fit-looking man, even in old age, wearing a leather jacket and a flat cloth cap. Aunt Annie was one of a group of berry pickers crossing a trestle when the train came. Some jumped, and she didn't. My mother always said Aunt Annie had a little shoulder harness to hold a pen and had lovely handwriting. None of that is earth-shaking, but it's all interesting, isn't it? And my mother hasn't written it down. I mean, the ball is squarely in my court. Most of the rest of Aunt Annie's life is already lost to time. So that kind of photo is a great and useful place to start recording your memories. You can also write from an old family letter, and I think I skipped one. Yep, or a document. I have a discharge paper from the Union Army for a grandfather named Bernard Stratman. He got to keep his horse and his rifle. He's the one who first came to the U.S. from Germany in the early 1800s. My father always called him, this is ironic, a draft dodger in the Napoleonic Wars. He lived in Kentucky, and the family story is he hid a woman named Susanna who escaped from the Trail of Tears, the forced march of Cherokees out of their farms and towns in Georgia. And later he married her. And of course, there's no stories to tell in any of that. Unfortunately, most of them are gone. Another prompt, your military experience or your college experience, your youth in the Great Depression, a family calamity, all are great for memoir. The time the house burned, the time Grandpa worked in the factory as a child and almost fell into the sausage machine. A favorite dog, cat, horse. James Herriot built an entire career around animal stories, or stories of himself with animals. There are so many memories riding around in your mind that will disappear with you. You need to not let that happen. People often tell me they're just not sure they can get the whole thing down. They start and then they're kind of overwhelmed. They're not writers naturally, and it just seems like too much. Writers sometimes feel this way too. Here's a useful thought from Stephen King. He says, I know there's a house under there, and I'm pretty sure I can dig it up if I want. That's how I feel. It's like the stories are already there. And of course, in our cases with Memoir, they are already there. What they pay me for is the leap of faith that says if I sit down and do this, everything will come out okay. Stephen King. And so that's my message to you and your message to yourself. If you sit down and do this, everything will be okay. Yeah, it will. So let's say you settle on a particular memory. What next? How do you start a memoir? One of my favorite memoir first lines is this one. I am about to buy a house in a foreign country. This is Frances May's beginning to Under the Tuscan Sun, a favorite and much read book. The first thing to know about a first sentence is that it is intended to attract and inspire you, and to coax or compel you to read the second sentence. Ray Bradbury used to say, somebody asked him how he wrote. He said, I write one really good sentence. And they said, well, what then? He said, well, I'll try to write another really good sentence. And that's how it works. The first thing to know about a first sentence is, I already read that. Frances May's is starting at the beginning of her narrative, but not everybody does, and you don't have to. You can start with something startling, like this, from The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, about her life. She said, I was sitting in a taxi, wondering if I had overdressed for the evening, when I looked out the window and saw Mom rooting through a dumpster. That's a pretty good first line. I do favor the offbeat or startling first line category. Here are a couple of quick possibilities. These are mine. I suppose I should tell you the truth about my brother Michael. That has possibilities, huh? Another on this same topic could be, same event, the jelly bean nearly killed my brother. I get fewer laughs on that one, but it's still interesting. I mean, how's that going to happen? This could be the first line about a brother whose appendix burst on Easter Sunday and how he almost died, and that's true. One of my father's stories, I think he included it in the Nenana book, could begin with this line. I ran to the fire, little knowing it would be the cold that nearly killed me. That makes you want to read on, don't you think? Yeah? As a volunteer fireman running to fight a fire, a late-night fire in Nenana, temperature minus 35 degrees, he got drenched by a flyaway high-pressure hose. You have minutes, really, before you start to freeze. Or this for my own life. In my family, I'm known as the one who runs toward fire. And this comes from, I think I was supposed to push the button on those. Oh well, I'm a little behind. One night late, my first wife and I were heading home from a concert, and we saw an automobile accident. And the vehicle that got hit went in a wide circle. This was in Seattle. And it went around about 3 times, smashing into things. And I kept saying to my wife, and the woman that got hit had jumped out of the truck. It was a truck, actually, and fallen down on the sidewalk, bleeding. And I said, okay, go to get her. But every time she started to get out of the car, the truck came back around. It was just driving itself. The throttle was jammed. 3rd or 4th time around, it goes into a gas station and hits the pumps and sheared off the first of the pumps. And, you know, I saw a bullet on TV. I was expecting the explosion. But it didn't explode. It sat there. It stopped right there, sat there over the pump with the engine winding out and smoke or steam coming out in clouds. And I remember thinking to myself, I need to turn that engine off. So I started running. And I also remember thinking, this is the stupidest thing I have ever done. But I managed to get into the truck, and you couldn't see anything, and find the ignition and turn it off. And then I jumped back out, and I turned to run away, and something went wham! And my heart just about stopped. I don't know what it was that made that noise. But so anyway, that's a good first line for something like that. And of course, it makes a darn good story. And this brings us to number 4 on my list, and I'm going to skip that. I told my wife, I'm skipping number 4, and she said, you can't skip number 4. And I said, well, I'll come back to it. She said, yeah, but number 4 is supposed to be after number 3 and before number 5. But I'm skipping it. All right, so I want you to jump ahead in your imagination to the time after you've finished your memoir, because this is something people often don't get to. After you finish your memoir that we're going to talk about in number 4, what are you going to do with that thing? And here's what I hope you'll do. Publish. And there are a lot of things that people think when they see that. They think, I don't want to be a novelist. I don't want to be published. I don't want to, you know. And I get it, you know. A lot of memoirs are private family documents. But here's what happens often. People write a memoir and drop it in a drawer, or maybe they don't even print it. It's just in a computer. You can't even, it's not like you can hold a disc up or something and see what they wrote. They count on somebody else to find this thing and do something. You know, somebody's going to go through your stuff after you leave. You really want to rely on them to find something that you sat down and suffered over? If it's worth writing, and I can tell you right now it is, then it's worth being deliberate about making sure that the people you wrote it for get to see it. My father wrote his whole life, and he's been dead for about 12 years, and I have yet to make it through the last few fruit boxes, the big sturdy ones, of his pages. To be sure, I know that most of it is drafts for what he did publish, or he was a priest again, so a lot of it, I mean, he wrote sermons and he wrote a newspaper column and things like that. Of course, if the house burns or something else happens to me, any other gems he's created are likely lost. So after you've written, there are a few things you can do and should do, starting from very simple. Here they are. First, always make a backup copy. You'd be amazed how many people have one copy in one computer that turns on them. Yeah. Second, Print the darn thing out. You know, 100 years from now, or 200, when they're looking at our civilization, trying to figure out where we went wrong, there's not going to be as much paper, you know. When we look at earlier civilizations, we can find things written on sheepskin in caves that tell us more than people will be able to figure out about our generation. I have this image of people holding up CDs and DVDs to the light, trying to get something from them besides a reflection of their own faces. So print it out, put it on paper, have it bound, or the other thing you really need to do, give it to someone. You can put a copy into someone's hands. You can say, I wrote this, I'd like you to read it. You can ask them to read it now. You can ask them to read it later after you've shuffled off. But it's important. And then this is the last thing, and this is really the publish part. Set it up for POD, print on demand. And then this, print on demand is your friend. And here's the deal with print on demand. I publish with a company called Create Space. And the beauty of it is that you write what you write and you format it, and then you go online and you upload it. And when you get the format right, and you can hire somebody else to do this if you don't want to do it yourself, but then it's on file there. It's essentially in the cloud, and you can buy as many copies or no copies as you want, or you can just tell your offspring that it's there and they can buy copies. But the point is, it's available. It doesn't have to go any farther than that. You don't have to put it up for sale on Amazon. But at that point, it's official and available. It's not lost. It doesn't go to the Goodwill with your computer. It doesn't melt with your DVDs or, you know, whatever the things are that can happen. One book or 1,000 books, and you don't have to buy any, but it's there. Okay, and I mentioned 5 points, and I cheated you on the 4th for the moment, but there's a 6th point that I always mention to people. When you write your memoir, if you feel the need to set the record straight, this is the time to do it. This is the time to tell your story. Last call. But it's not the time, in my opinion, it's not the time for gotcha or last tag. So here's what to remember. That's not it. Oh, I skipped it. Never mind. Sorry. Be kind. Be accurate. Be honest. You're not going to be around to say, oh, that's not what I meant. Or, gosh, I'm sorry. Or the heck with you, I'm not sorry. You know, whatever it is that you say. I haven't been keeping track of time. Where are we? It's break time? Okay, well, let's pause here then. Okay, everybody, I'm now ready with the number that you've all been waiting for. It's time for number 4. Rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. I know it doesn't sound very sexy. Billy, I don't think we're going to get to that. No. Great writing isn't just written. I mean, people don't own up to this a lot. I wrote a book. Well, most books are written 4 or 5 or 10 times. And the other thing is, and people often say this, wait a minute, I don't want to write great literature, I just want to leave something for the kids. great literature, which isn't just the bestseller. Great literature is writing in any category that draws us along. It paints a picture in our heads and sticks with us. The kind of thing you read and then find yourself thinking about later. The kind of thing that you sit down. My son called me and he said I was trying to go to sleep and I grabbed a book. Happily, he grabbed one of mine, which he'd been avoiding, honestly. Not that I'm selling myself as great literature, but he read it to go to sleep, and what happened is it kept him awake half the night. Gosh, that's too bad, isn't it? That kind of writing can come from anywhere. It's compelling reading. And your writing needs to be as compelling as you can make it. The fact that it's yours, the fact that it's personal, the fact that it's only for the kids or the grandkids, it doesn't matter. It's your life. It's worth everything you can put into it. It's worth rewriting, playing with. Now here's an example of a first line I've written. It actually, this may interest you. When I started preparing for this talk and started to think seriously about memoir, I don't know if Billy said to me, well, why don't you write your own memoir? Or, something to that effect. Or she has lots of good ideas. And, but the more I worked on this, the more I thought, well, gosh, I ought to start my own memoir. Sounding easier and easier the more I wrote. So I did. And I played with some first lines because that's just what I do. So anyway, here's a possible first line for my memoir. And that's not it. I got off the train in a small town in Alaska. The year was 1955, and I was 7 years old. Okay. So, it's a first sentence. But when you look at it, it's pretty flat, really. One of the things that makes it flat, and one of the first things you change when you write your first sentence or any sentence, is verbs of being. Was. It was 1955. I was 7 years old. Those are really uninteresting words. And so the fewer of those you can write in a line or a paragraph or a book, the happier your reader will be. All right, so let's take another stab at it. Nenana, Alaska, July 1955. It sounds like a dateline, doesn't it? I stepped down from the train, all of 7 years old, ready for adventure. The verbs of being are gone, the passive verbs. The dateline sounds like news, like Berlin or East Oshkosh or something. We replaced got off, which sounds a little flat, with stepped down, which is a little more visual. You can see it. I'm still 7 years old in this version, but now it sounds like a good thing. It sounds like an interesting thing, and we're ready for adventure. Now we're not just talking about what's in the scene, but what's likely to be in the narrative. We're promising what's to come. We're setting the stage like a bumper in a TV show. Stay tuned, because in a couple of minutes I'm going to tell you something really cool. That kind of thing. Okay, we're still not finished with this. One of the most effective techniques a writer can use is to imagine the scene, your scene, even though you were in it and lived it, but to imagine it like it's a scene in a movie. Close your eyes if it helps. See your original scene again. See the details, the light, the historical period, which sounds a little odd. I mean, we don't feel that old, most of us. But think about the difference between 2017 and 1955. Whoa. cars, music, clothes, people talking to their watches or, things. No, different effect in 1955. And then write from what you see in this movie vision of you in your past. And when I do that, I get something more like this. Now, one thing, of course, is that it's longer, but we don't care, do we? We want it to be descriptive. On a warm July day in 1955, I stepped down from the train in the dusty river town of Nenana, Alaska. I was 4,500 miles from Boston, from home, and I felt like it. Beyond a wide, unpaved main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, lay mostly single-story log cabins and shingled shacks. Though gray and weather-beaten, to me, 7 years old and ready for adventure, it looked wonderful, even magical. I saw an article a couple of days ago about all the things the iPhone has helped to eliminate. Have you thought about this? They mentioned alarm clocks as one of the fatalities. Does a 20 or 30-something need to buy an alarm clock? Nope. Alarm clock makers are in deep, deep trouble. Heck no, just use the cell phone. They also don't need wristwatches or road maps, printed maps, the newspaper, photo film, and many cameras. In some cases, they don't even need a radio, TV, video player, a calculator, flashlight, or even a carpenter's level. You can get an app to make your phone into a carpenter's level. The list goes on. So to get maximum effect and understanding out of your memoir, you need to build in the information a reader needs to understand and appreciate what you're telling them. You can't take any of that stuff for granted because your kids and especially your grandkids have no idea what you're talking about. One of my book series takes place in 1955. Although much of that seems clear to me, I have to occasionally remind myself that 1955 was more than half a century ago. Now, if the audio works on this, I'm going to play you a piece that I produced for NPR. It's 3 minutes long. It's part of a series called Who Died Today? And it doesn't mean literally today, this day. It means today in history. Vernell Judy actually worked as a researcher on this project, and it was she who brought me this story. And I looked at it, and I think I said to Billy, I think Vernell has gone completely off, her trolley has gone completely off the tracks. But it's become not only a popular piece in this series, but my favorite, and it's filled with setup. But if it actually plays, I guess we're having trouble with audio, you'll see what I mean. So this is Who Died Today, and it's the story, if it plays, of Martha Washington. Martha Washington died today, September 1st, 1914. No, not that Martha Washington, mother of our country, but her namesake, a 29-year-old passenger pigeon who spent her entire life in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo. She was the last one, mother of none, since the two males in captivity with her had died years earlier. Martha was hatched in 1885 when it was already becoming clear that passenger pigeons were in trouble. Just 5 years earlier, they had been considered the most numerous species in the United States, numbering into billions. Wintering in the southeast, they'd fly north in the spring to nest in the vast forest lands around the Great Lakes. But with civilization on the way west, it wasn't long before many of the large forest areas disappeared. And the new settlers arrived hungry. Pigeon pie, tasty and free, was on every menu. Releasing passenger pigeons for target practice became popular, the genuine article before today's clay pigeons. By the 1890s, it was already all over. They had been large, beautiful birds capable of flying at 60 to 70 miles an hour, their numbers shadowing the sky as they passed. But they couldn't outfly the fleeter shadow of their own destiny. And unlike ducks or geese that can hunker down in pairs, passenger pigeons required large flocks for breeding, feeding, and for survival. There simply wasn't a way they could be restored through any form of captive breeding. In 1890, the last known wild flock was killed by hunters who, it is said, killed them because they were the last known wild flock. And about a decade later, a 14-year-old boy in Ohio, reportedly also knowing what he was doing, shot the last wild passenger pigeon. So Martha, in her holding cell in Cincinnati, was always a dead bird walking. There are those who will say that a bird is just a bird. But what is the last bird, or the last of any living creature? Martha lived 15 more years without seeing another of her kind, without hearing that familiar call, certainly without breeding or nesting or doing any of the things that every other living creature on the planet gets to do. So tonight, as you kiss the kids and pat the dog, snuggle down together and whisper in the dark, keep a kind thought for all creatures left lonely through no fault of their own, and particularly for Martha, the last passenger pigeon who died today, September 1st, 1914. I'm Jonathan Thomas Stratman. You hear how much of that is set up? Thank you. I'm glad you like it because I think there are 54 of those pieces, and that, in spite of my saying to Vernell that I think I said, "You're nuts, Vernell." That's my favorite. But you hear what I mean about setup. You have to understand the historical context to really be affected and for the story to work the way it needs to work, to be successful. Okay, one last thing, and then we'll give over to questions because I know you got cheated on the first segment. I have an episode, or not an episode, just a bit from one of my mysteries. This takes place in 1955, and since readers, many of my readers, they weren't even imagined in 1955. And so one of the ways that I sort of project them into the moment is it's come to be kind of a convention in the different books, is often they gather either at the coffee cup restaurant to sit and talk, and the radio's always on. So I'll just read you a sample of this. We were crowded around a table in the coffee cup cafe under the bright red neon of a saucer and a steamy cup of joe. Here in Chandelar, the coffee cup is home to the heavy, bottomless mug of coffee for a quarter, and for 75 cents a stack of sourdough pancakes served with your choice of nearly black molasses, sweet fireweed honey, or summer canned strawberry jam. It was dark outside. The sun wouldn't rise for another couple of hours. But with the large picture window, a frozen sheet of ice, we couldn't see out anyway. For a quarter, we had 3 tunes on the jukebox. One of them was Patti Page, who was singing her new hit, Tennessee Waltz, which, even though it's not about Tennessee, still managed to make me a little homesick for Sewanee. So I use a passage like this, and you can too in a memoir. If you're talking about what you did, my father, for example, talked about coming up from the basement on a day in 1941. He lived in Kentucky, and coming up from what was essentially a root cellar to hear Franklin Roosevelt on the radio telling him, saying that we'd been attacked, Pearl Harbor had been attacked. and that my father wouldn't be going to college for the next 4 years. He'd be going to France. And so in your memoir, you can reach out for anything you need to label your scene and your time in a way that people will understand. If it's a popular song, if it's a new invention. I mean, you can bring, it doesn't have to be just stream of conscious, this is what I remember and this is what I had on or something. It's all fair. Bring everything to the party. Oh, and then one last thing. I taught school for about 10 years, and I really wanted to write. I mean, I had begun to sell short fiction, and I was a Cricket magazine regular, and that was something I was really proud of because that was a really quality kids magazine. So when I left teaching, I used my fiction and some newspaper features I'd written to get a job with a Seattle outdoor company called Early Winters. From there, I went on to Eddie Bauer and then on to advertising agencies. But my first day at Early Winters, my new boss, a completely unpleasant person, told me something important that I've never forgotten, and I've slowly adapted it to sound like this, and I leave this with you because it's extremely useful and supports point number 4. Words are plastic. We put them down on the page or the screen. We bend and twist them around until they work for us, until they tell our story, the story we need to tell, until they beg to be read. And so that's your assignment. Memoirs are pretty accessible. You just got to sit down, do it. And remember number 4, always rewrite. So, questions? Well, that was easy.
Hi, Jonathan. You were talking to me there several places. In 1988, I decided it was important to start writing down, even for my own memory as I got older, let alone passing it on to the grandkids. And so I did an outline, and it's still there, hasn't been touched in 20 years. I go back and look at it, and it says, I did this, we did that, exactly what you're talking about. It just looks like an awful lot of work to put that in readable prose. So I'm procrastinating that what they got is better than nothing. You want to give me some more inspiration?
Well, I think you're right. I think writing something is better than nothing, although an outline is a little thin to leave for the kids. There are some writers who write faithfully from an outline. Aaron Elkins, that I mentioned earlier, is one of them. He knows everything that's going to happen in his book when he starts writing. I know nothing. I start at the beginning and I follow. I mean, it's like, have you seen those tennis shoes that little kids wear that have the lights on them? I always wish that I had a pair of those because, you know, if you get lost, you could just follow your feet home. And that's how I write. I start with a situation or a character. In my first book, it's called Indecent Exposure, and I need to tell you, I was at a book show recently, and a woman said, am I going to blush if I read this? And I said, well, I don't think so. In Alaska, especially Alaska 50 years ago when it truly was colder, indecent exposure doesn't mean you blush, it means you freeze. They're different. So what you do, I was going to tell you, so I started with the priest going out from town by dog sled with a couple of mushers to pick up a frozen body. And they get out there and they find that the guy has been shot. It's either a murder or a suicide, but they can't find the gun. And one of them says, well, maybe he shot himself in town and walked out here. But the thing is, when I wrote it, for a reason that I no longer remember, I know. I had him in the snowdrift, this dead guy, and I had him spread-eagled. Frozen, solid, spread-eagled. And I did that because when I was a kid and they went out to pick up a body, they usually took a sleeping bag because they usually froze in convenient ways and you could just stuff them in a bag. My father did that a fair amount of the time, and I wanted to confound these. And so the scene I have, and this is why I did it that way, was they put him on a dog sled and they kind of tied him in place, kind of on one foot and one hand. So the other hand looks like it's waving to the crowd when they get back to town. But then a terrible thing happened. Somebody read an early draft when I hadn't finished the book. Or maybe I had finished I guess I had finished the first draft. They read a first draft and they said, oh boy, I can't wait to find out why he was spread-eagled in that snowdrift. I thought, oh, I don't really know. And so I had the whole book to figure out, and I did, a reason that guy was like that and left like that. So anyway, all by way of saying, I don't know that if you're an outline person, sure, work from an outline, but most of us, remember Ray Bradbury, write a good sentence and then write the next good sentence and use your time that way because you know the story. You don't really need an outline, at least not for that episode. That's what I think. Anybody else?
Sharon Johnson.
Yeah.
Just because no one else is raising their hand.
Slackers.
Yeah. Want to know, I love your idea of the main sentence. The first one, it's super sentence, the glass house, that was the best part of the book. But how do you keep it going in an interesting way without going on and on? I don't want to pick up a box, like you say, of a memoir. That's my question. But since we've mentioned Ray Bradbury a couple of times, I have to just share, I did have dinner with the man when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I don't know if I was single then or not, but anyway, was on a train from Corvallis down to Glendale or Los Angeles area, and it was the day of the white linen cloth and the nice service on the trains.
You hear she's doing it. She's filling in the memoir. She's painting the picture.
There I go, yeah. Good student. But anyway, and got in the dining car, being single, and I've always found being alone on traveling is just the best place for material. But was seated next to this very handsome man, in a nice suit, sport, very dapper, a little twinkle in his eye, and didn't know who he was. Sat down and he asked, do you read? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, what are some things you read? And I mentioned, I tried to dig back into the best I read in high school and, brought up the prestigious books. And he said, well, do you like science fiction? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, well, allow me to introduce myself, Ray Bradbury. And I was madly searching. Oh, I said, oh, yes, Illustrated Man I had read. And so he then, I said, well, what are you doing now? And he mentioned he was writing for Martian Chronicles, a play on New York or something. And I said, oh, I didn't know you wrote plays. And he said, I never have. But I do believe in jumping off a cliff and growing your wings on the way down. So I always thought that was a neat one.
That's a good image. I plan to use that. Yeah. Is Mike here?
Thank you. The gentleman over there, I don't know your name, but Don, you gave me a fantastic idea about writing your memoirs. I have 10 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. And rather than looking at your narrative as just an academic or mechanical piece, there's individual stories that you have for each child. And I like to personalize my relationship with each individual one. And that might be an idea that when you go back and you look and personalize and give them a gift of you that they can remember individually. You're welcome.
Yeah, that's a nice
With
idea.
a photo.
Perfect. Anybody else? All right. You have been wonderful. Thank you so much.
And we thank you.